The country's biggest movie theatre is limping. Ster-Kinekor is entering voluntary business rescue with the hope of facilitating the company's rehabilitation. The cinema house, with 55 outlets across South Africa, says the COVID-19 pandemic and restriction on international distribution have had them operating at a loss for several months. Ster-Kinekor says the continued lack of content for the next 4 to 5 months means that the business is heading for further operational and cash flow challenges. It's hoping the business rescue process will act as a safe harbour as it tries to return to profitability. Ster-Kinekor says cinemas will remain open during this process. The COVID-19 pandemic has had a substantial impact on the film industry in 2020, mirroring its impacts across all arts sectors. Across the world and to varying degrees, cinemas and movie theatres have been closed, festivals have been cancelled or postponed, and film releases have been moved to further dates or delayed indefinitely. Joining us now to discuss how the sector will find recovery is chairperson of the South African Guild of Actors, Jack Diffnerane. A very good evening to you and thank you so much for joining us. Well, before we get to the recovery side, what exactly would you say is the extent of the impact the pandemic and extended lockdown has had on our industry?
I think we all have fears about the productivity and the profitability of our sector. We are deeply concerned, especially about live theatre, musical theatre, and we can see that there's very little hope of retrieving viable productions that are going to be staged in the theatres around the country. We have seen that there's been some movement in the production of film and television, and that's been important. Again, conditions under which we are required to operate demand enormous resources being brought to bear so that people are protected. There's the availability of PPEs, sanitizers, and of course there must be a protocol for testing for everybody who's involved. So there has been a tremendous negative impact as we try to maintain productivity. It's been limping, and we are hoping that with as restrictions for the lockdown are uplifted gradually, and with the introduction of the vaccine, there may be a ray of hope.
And what the productions that you mentioned are still able to currently function, obviously under the strict regulations of COVID-19, do they have sufficient budget or resources that they had backed up for such situations to be able to continue running for until lockdown restrictions are lifted completely?
No, productions were never able to budget for the tremendous drain on their resources. So at the time, a lot of these productions were actually shooting. The production contracts were signed months before the onset of our lockdown and the restrictions that ensued. So nobody was really able to make any kind of budgetary provisions for the additional costs that would then be applied. Productions really had to try their best, and they had to try and find the resources in order simply just to keep moving along. Screen and film production, yes, they have found ways, but as far as live theatre goes, it's simply been devastating. That part of the sector is a wasteland, and it really means that in order for productions to be staged, they will have to be viable, and that means putting more people into those theatres. And of course, auditoriums are restricted anyway.
And what is your reaction then to the news that we received earlier on of Ster-Kinekor entering voluntary business rescue? What cascading effect might this have?
The cascading effect, I think the fact that Ster-Kinekor has gone into voluntary business rescue is the effect of that cascading effect. So you have productions that are slowing down or not turning out the kind of content that they would normally do. That in turn impacts the value chain, and the exhibitors are the last ones in that value chain who actually put those movies up on big screen.
We seem to have lost Jack Diffnerane. We will try and reconnect him there. Jack, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I think we have a bad connection. Um, yes, the exhibitor basically is the last element of the value chain, and they will be feeling the full effects now. There's very little that they can do because they need to access content. If the content is not available, they won't be able to put anything on the big screen. So we are hopeful that they can ride out the storm and make other resources available in order to sustain their business, hopefully to adapt the business model long enough until we can get back online.
Now, we've also seen some local series, locally produced series being streamed on platforms such as Netflix. Do you consider this a bit of a glimmer of hope under the current circumstances?
It really was a matter of survival, and we are hugely grateful that at least we have a platform and a number of platforms, in fact, that were able to take South African content and make them available through streaming services. So I don't think we've been able to make full use of the medium itself, but certainly as far as the independent film and television production sector goes, we have at least had some movement. Obviously, we can see that going forward in months to come, and hopefully these relationships can be secured further in months to come. Obviously, at the end of the day, everybody needs to survive the pandemic. Businesses need to survive the pandemic, and of course, we hopefully will see more productions coming out, not just in the streaming services, but going back to the big screen as well.
And do you think that perhaps once the lockdown is completely lifted, we will see the industry recovering completely?
We may not be able to say that there'll be a complete recovery just yet. We imagine that production companies and the sector itself will have to reorganize itself. It'll have to look at different kinds of insurances, because that's certainly one of the big budget line items that's changed. So we believe that the business is going to change in order to adapt and survive, but we can't say for sure at this point whether the industry will be able to return to what we remember it to be once we have all the restrictions uplifted.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. That was the chairperson of the South African Guild of Actors, Jack Devnarain.